Hello, my name is Grace Lynch, and I am sharing a set of tools that I call the Language Box Perspective. The purpose of the tools is to give me a way into language that works with my autism but can still have a place in the neurotypical world. It's a fairly common problem for an autistic person to have issues with sorting out social context and language in social context. I've lived inside that problem my entire life. As a late diagnosed autistic person, I wasn't diagnosed till the age of 52. Um, I didn't understand the language world into which I was born, and it presented barriers to me that persisted throughout my life until I was in my mid 40s. I don't consider this a fault of the world. I don't consider it a defect of the world either. What I do consider as uh, is a manifestation of a problem that arises when there's certain assumptions about how a brain works and no safe way to work outside the limits and bounds of that. Um, I hold bachelor's degrees in mathematics, English, and computer science. And granted, they're not graduate level, but they're at least college level. And I learned enough about logic, binary systems, and the nature of written language and expressive language to understand that grasping hold of the facts of what's offered in the world was not sufficient to give me a way to understand how language works, to have a voice that could work in the neurotypical world. One of the problems that a person faces in language that I find often isn't talked about is that language is not only about meaning and context, and it's not only about semantics and intonation, connotation, denotation, a circumstance. It also has to do with the need of a person to develop a voice for their inward experience in a way that the result of expressing that voice results in human relationship, either establishing it or improving it. So if I have a voice for my experience, but the act of using that voice alienates the people around me, that's not a very adaptive form of language. My experience was that doing my level best to understand the language that was offered to me by the world and to practice the rules I was given, the rules for interaction, the rules for correcting each other, the rules for interpreting. Doing my level best to do that from a very young age resulted in conflict and alienating the people around me. I didn't understand why. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do. So, as a child growing up, I looked to the world, to the teachers and other adults, my parents, to teach me about how to conduct myself in the world. And what I experienced was that the act of trusting them got me injured. For example, when I learned about the rules of grammar, my mother was the most gifted grammarian I've ever met in my life. She believed at the end of her life that she was also autistic, so but she gave me the rules of grammar, and then she also helped me understand that using proper grammar is the way people are supposed to talk to each other. So, wanting to do what she wanted me to do and feeling like I was being a good boy, if I observed those rules, I practiced them meticulously. My brain drinks in rules like nobody I've ever met. And unfortunately, though, I took for granted that this she was talking about not an ideal world. She was talking about the way the world actually was. And I just have to tell you that, in my experience, a 7-year-old correcting the grammar of a 30-something-year-old person in the company of other 30-somethings does not end well. From my perspective, I was doing what my mother had taught me to the best of my ability, and the result was being punished. My father was involved in civil rights, and he he started teaching me about social justice issues, and we would talk about it in the family, go to dinner parties, and I would listen because I love my father. I wanted to. I he was so he was so wise. People trusted him. My mother trusted him. So I listened, and then I listened inside the language. And what I heard, and this is about age 8 or 9, was that when people talked about social justice issues, they had a way of classifying the people who were part of the problem, like racist people or sexist people. And the bone they had to pick with them was that those people demonized other people without knowing them based on observations they made about a person they didn't know. So, from the social justice perspective, they were decrying the behavior of people that treated a person badly because of the color of their skin or the nature of their gender expression or identity. I don't think we were very evolved in gender identity and expression back in the 70s yet. So, from my perspective, listening to this and processing it, and I was being taught to be logical and reasonable, I saw my parents and their friends talking about a class of people that they didn't know and observing them, and based on their observations without knowing them, making judgments and decisions about how those people felt, what they meant, and how it was appropriate to treat them based on their perceptions. And I thought to myself as 8 or 9 years old, why do you get to treat them differently and they don't get to do that to you? What makes it okay for you to prejudge them without knowing them, but it's not okay for them to prejudge the people that you're trying to protect? And I didn't understand what it was. I didn't understand the difference between children and adults. I didn't understand really much of anything. So I had no way of perceiving, making sense of what was happening. My parents were telling me to use reason and encouraging me to be intelligent and to listen and to process and to be logical. And then I saw that form of reasoning in action demonstrated to me that I could not trust my parents to teach me things that made any sense. So I had learned that my mother could not be trusted to teach me about how to carry myself in the world. Trusting her got me hurt. And when I got to my father, I experienced that listening to him and what he valued demonstrated to me not equality, but privilege, an entitlement to decide how someone else should be to meet your agenda. And so by the time I was like 9 years old, I had learned that I couldn't trust my parents to teach me about things. And many years later, I would learn better. But at the time, growing up, it was hard. I didn't feel like I could trust other adults because why would they be more helpful than my parents? My parents were the ones I was supposed to be able to trust altogether. So I looked at their children, and I was like 10 years old, and my father passed. He was 46. He'd been overweight and didn't exercise because it was the 70s. And our family was kind of leveled, and there was like one kid who was an older boy, and I palled around with him. And anyway, interacting with him led to sexual assault, and I didn't understand at the time what he had done to me. Uh, I was horrified though because I didn't understand what I'd done wrong. Because at the end of the sexual assault, he was angry at me about something. I was like, after he was done, he was somehow angry that I did something wrong. And he shifted from being my closest friend to being one of the worst bullies in the neighborhood for me. And so what that taught me was that I couldn't trust other children or friendship either. So I came to focus more on books. I give you some more background information. I was tested in second grade and told that I could read and do mathematics at an eighth grade level. My IQ was measured in the 160s. In those days, we were called gifted or precocious. Um, Asperger's would not be a term in popular culture until the 90s. By then, I'd be in my 30s and have 2 kids of my own. So I didn't know anyone like me, and no teachers had met people like me. And when I went through school, I had accepted before my teen years started that I couldn't trust other adults to teach me safely how to conduct myself, and I couldn't look to other kids to provide safety and peer support. From my perspective, everybody else got to make the rules, and I was wrong whether I went by them or didn't go by them. And both being myself and or trying to fit in or not trying to fit in, everything I did got me injured, and I didn't know why. I came to feel like I was a bad person or an alien or broken inside. I started smoking, then drinking, and other drugs, and by the time I was about 16, I was getting pretty heavy into stuff. So when I was in my senior of high school, I made my first best friend. We're still best friends today. I also found mathematics, calculus, and it turned out I was very gifted in it. I found logic. I loved logic because logic is perfect. By which I mean logic, formal logic is actually very, very precise. It only has an opinion on what happens when a person starts with something that's true. So that's the only place where logic applies at all. When it's something that's false, just false, random falseness, as far as logic is concerned, Elvis has left the building. It has no. If you start with something false, you could end up in something true or something false, or New Jersey, or strawberry ice cream, or another dimension, or on Doctor Who's TARDIS. But when you're in something that's true, you know where it goes, and you could trust that. From my perspective, since I could understand how logic worked and also that it was the same for everybody, then it was also safe to stay on the same page with people or correct each other if there was a problem. And that was the first sense I ever had in my life that I might have be able to build a career. Because the problem wasn't doing processing. The problem was interacting with other humans who were trying to do the same processing and having to resolve issues in language with them as a condition for employment. And it's not possible to get along in a job where there's no way to resolve conflict with anyone. So logic gave me my first hope that I could build an adult life, and I was 17 years old. Uh, Eventually, I found my way into college and majoring in mathematics. And my best friend, who I met while we were drinking together, introduced me to poetry. So I started writing as well, but writing was something that I liked without understanding why. It's not rationally bound. It was actually very disturbing to me that I liked it, uh, but I liked it. So when I went to college, I chose to double major mathematics and English. The problem that I faced was that to me, mathematics and poetry were the same thing. They're not different versions of each other. Math isn't some kind of metaphor for poetry or vice versa. They're exactly the same thing. It's like a pair of pants that are green and a pair of pants that are blue. They're identical. No one in my life saw things that way. So the further I got along in my education, I got affirmation that my writing was good and people liked my how I did that. I got the affirmation that my mathematics was good and people liked how I did that. But when I started talking about poetic ideas in mathematics and making, I don't, there was a, I wanted a set theory for elements that aren't there, like the imaginary element or something. If there's an empty set, why can't you have an empty element? And in poetry, I wanted to know like the sequence of implications. So to me, it felt like they were the same, and I was trying to unify them in my head so I have a language to speak from my experience, and no one around me saw them as the same. That was a problem. So as my education proceeded, I wanted to know why this is a problem. I want to know what the deal is. How can I possibly see something so very differently from anyone else? Why does what they're seeing make sense to them? Why do the math people instinctively get revolted by the artsy, poetic people, and vice versa? Actually, felt the animosity. They were on different sides of the campus, and they should never interact or mingle. It was like being the redheaded stepchild or something. So I wanted to study why. things were different, and I started looking into logic. And I studied a lot of different logicians over the years. I looked into Zeno, Aristotle, Plato, Pascal, and then updating further to Russell and the British rationalists. And I came across the work of a little Austrian logician from the 1940s who was a friend of Einstein eventually by the name of Kurt Gödel. Douglas Hofstadter wrote a book called Gödel Escher Bach. I never read it, but I noticed it at the time, um, around that time. And when I read Gödel's work, Gödel did a PhD thesis that established that if you could have a logical system that was capable of encapsulating all of the knowledge of mathematics or generating it, it would necessarily have the inherent quality of either being inconsistent or incomplete. I didn't expect that result, and when I saw that from my perspective, he had showed me that if I relied on logic as a system to live my life and resolve social issues, I would hit a snag. I didn't have to know when the snag would come. I just had to know it was there. Either I would have some reason when logic would suddenly become unreliable as a consistent, understandable system, or there would be some kind of reasoning that whatever system wasn't capable of handling. It was incomplete. Um, I depended on logic to plan my entire future. And when I read Gödel's work, I didn't trust that anymore. From my perspective, the entire apparatus that I was using to build the rest of my life had collapsed. Nobody had done anything. Logic had disqualified logic. Uh, I started drinking more heavily, doing a lot more drugs. I didn't have any reason to continue because I couldn't build a way forward from there. Without a way to understand what I was doing for work and how to communicate that with other people socially and hold my own in a workplace, build relationships and dating and stuff like that, I didn't have any sense that a life was possible. I didn't want to kill myself, but I didn't know how to build anything, so I drank and I used drugs. On August 15th, 1987, I took a lot of LSD and I freaked out. I decided that God hated me. I'm gay. Uh, God must hate me because I'm gay. But he really hates me because I can't understand the difference between mathematics and English when everybody else clearly can. And it's my fault because I'm too stupid to figure it out because clearly everybody else can do it. Why can't I? And I, I freaked out and decided the world was ending and it was a big freak out acid trip. And went inside the building. I climbed over this railing and I spread my arms wide and dove off, giving myself to God to prove my commitment that I was willing even to die. It was a pathetic suicide attempt because I dropped about 10 feet and landed on the next flight down. But I landed on my forehead. It went tsh, and it was 1987. And in those days, it wasn't common knowledge that a person could do any kind of serious damage to his brain without, if he hit his head and didn't lose consciousness. I didn't know that, certainly. And the movie Concussion was years off. So I didn't understand in the aftermath of that fall. My friends had seen me run to the building. They had called the ambulance. They had come and scooped my babbling butt up onto a cot, taking me to the ER, and all they could do was wait for me to come down off the acid. Uh, I I didn't understand that I could have sustained a serious head injury, and I did. When I came down, I did my best to answer questions. Nobody reported that I had fallen, so I knew if I reported it as a suicide attempt, they would lock me up. I didn't want to get locked up, so I did my best to nod my head and say I'm okay, and they let me go. And I went to the friend's house and I went to the front room to lay down for a couple hours before having coffee. I figured they'd take me out after that. Uh, and and when I woke up a few hours later, about 11 in the morning, I came out into the living room and my friends were there and they talked to me. They turned to talk to me, and I couldn't understand what they were doing. Something told me that I should be able to do back what they were doing, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I didn't know what was missing. I would learn decades later that that's called expressive aphasia, and then a neurologist would explain it to me. It can sometimes be a consequence of a concussion. Uh, Most of the time it's short term. Mine was short term. But as I didn't have an understanding of it, I didn't know why my reality had changed so much. So I mostly kept to myself, and I was taken home, and nobody asked, and I didn't say anything. And in the days ahead, without any understanding that I had a medical problem, I thought I had a spiritual problem. It became so frightening not to be able to process language anymore, written, visual, oral, whatever, that I decided that I was maybe the Levitical people were right and God hated me and he had decided to take out his wrath on me and he had removed me from this universe and locked me outside of it. That became my working assumption for most of the rest of my life. My language did start to come back over the weeks after that, but I didn't have a way to psychologically come back. I didn't understand that there was no wall there. Uh, I would learn from a trauma therapist later that in some forms of trauma it can be so extreme that the centers in a person's mind in each hemisphere responsible for the subjective experience of the passage of time can become out of sync or paralyzed. Mine stopped. From my perspective, time stopped passing internally. I could see things happening around me, but I didn't feel anything was changing. Any event that happened was in a permanent state of happening for, actually, it was for the next 31 years. Uh, yeah, that was bad. The only reason I didn't kill myself is because I thought God hated me so much that even if reincarnation wasn't possible, he would invent it just because he enjoyed hurting me. And because from my perspective growing up, the people that cared most about you being they were supposed to hurt you because that's part of what people who cared about you did. I didn't understand that there was anything wrong with that. I thought it was my fault that I had not been smart enough to understand math and poetry and or start out being gay or any of those things. And so I deserved this punishment. And I reconciled myself for the rest of my life to being exiled. Uh, yeah. So I was able to manage through graduation. Most of my mathematics degree was done by then, except for some theory courses that were more thinking than they were processing a lot of visual symbols. I had been very good at processing symbols. After the fall, it felt like mathematics had gone from going along in a race car to walking hip deep in a pool of honey. To this day, my ability to process visual symbols is greatly impaired. It's painful. I listen and learn that way. Uh, so I I wanted to do things to try to come back. I still needed to be a young man. I tried to date women because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. I got married. We had a couple of kids. Both of us knew that I was gay going in, but we thought my faith could change it. Uh, our faith could change it. That didn't work. I'm so glad that I had my kids, but the marriage couldn't last. And very soon, like a few months after graduation, a few months after the marriage, I started seeking psychiatric help. And from 1989 to 2010, I was in and out of psych hospitals, inpatient, at least once a year, on high doses of most of the psychotropes that you can be on in combination for decades. I was almost always on some form of antidepressant, some kind of mood stabilizer now and then, and at least one, if not more, kind of traditional antipsychotic. Sometimes there'd be an anxiolytic added in, sometimes there'd be an atypical or experimental medication added in. I was put in most of the forms of individual and group therapy that were available to me. Nothing ever worked. About 15 years into this, they actually ran me through a series of electroconvulsive therapy. That didn't change anything. I actually agreed to that because although they explained it as a treatment for depression, I was hoping that if they ran electricity through my head enough times, it would burn out whatever part of my identity was non-functional, and in its place, maybe a new functional one would come into existence. That didn't happen. But I discovered that I tend to like orange juice after being electrocuted rather than apple juice. It's a personal choice. In 2010, I approached my medical doctor. I had gotten into recovery. I had wanted to learn how to live, how face life in the fullness of how it felt if I couldn't do anything else. Uh, in the aftermath of the divorce in 1994, I at least wanted to see if there was a way to go through life and experience it without altering it through recreational chemicals. I found 12-step recovery, a particular fellowship that made sense to me, and I stayed, working it very differently. So in 2010, I had been in recovery for a long time. And I approached my psychiatrist and I said, uh, uh, nothing that we've tried has changed my situation. They tried various diagnoses: depression, borderline, bipolar, schizophrenic, schizoaffective, uh, dysthymia, dissociation, like all kinds of stuff. They generally settled on schizoaffective, sort of, which is like the jackpot in terms of symptoms. It's like a mood disorder and a thought disorder at the same time. And I can talk more later about why that was the case because it had to do with my autism. But we wouldn't know that yet. I approached my shrink and I asked him, I said, since these are not doing anything, and you've been following me for a long time, my life hasn't come back. Do I have to stay on them? Because I was almost 300 pounds. I slept 12 to 14 hours a day. I went to meetings and I came home. I stayed to myself. I couldn't be social. I rarely got out of my chair. I watched movies, smoked cigarettes. I, 5 years prior to this conversation with him, I decided that for me, cigarettes was actually taking little breaks from reality and managed to stop using nicotine as well. But nothing had helped. No recovery had helped. No medicines had helped. No therapy had helped. So I asked him, does life have to be like this? Do I have to stay on these extraordinarily powerful medications when they're not going to produce the effect that he's looking for? To my astonishment, he agreed with me. And we devised a program whereby over the next almost nearly a year, I would slowly be weaned off of these. At that time, I was on some antidepressant, the antidepressant soup of the day, I don't know. I was also on stelazine and clozaril in high doses, which are both typical antipsychotics, and I was also on Abilify, which is an atypical antipsychotic. And he started weaning me off of these, and life started to change tremendously. As of Valentine's Day in 2011, I took my last dose of either of the traditional antipsychotics, but I was still on the Abilify, and my sleep schedule was just completely destroyed. There was a huge adjustment period for the next year. But all I can talk about here about language box work is that this is where a new phase of my life began. From my perspective, I had trusted that mental health was the last house on the block. In order to understand how life was, what I was, and how I fit into the world, and how expressing that could fit into relationships with other humans, I had tried every way known that I had available. I tried grammar, and it had failed. I tried social justice, and it had failed. I tried friendship, it had failed. I tried faith, and God hated me. I tried logic, and Kurt Gödel peed in my Cheerios about that. The last house on the block had been mental health. My understanding had been if a person had a problem, mental health was the catch all. It was the end of the road. Once you got there, people helped you. And now, from my perspective, mental health had tapped the mat. A qualified psychiatrist had said, I don't know. I can tell you that in the world in which I found myself, it's not a usual thing that a person has a mental health diagnosis that ever goes away. All the people with whom I had a relationship at that time processed me and I processed my relationship with them in terms of me having an identity as a mentally ill person. When the mental health industry tapped the mat and none of us had a new context, all of those relationships were disrupted. There was no help through there. So I had trusted every house in the block to build an understanding of my experience in a way that worked for me and I could feel safe, would work with the rest of the world and be functional for them so I could build community and things like that. I could not do that. I didn't know why. And every way that I had known up to that point, which were the only ways that I knew were available, all of them had failed. I'm not going to go back and use something once I know a tool doesn't work. There's no reason to be distracted. Recovery had worked, but for me, recovery was not about embracing hope. It was about I had looked back at my life. I spent a little time in state hospital, about 3 months. And that was when I heard about recovery from another patient. And I didn't get into recovery from recreational chemicals in my particular 12-step program because I knew it would work. I got into recovery because in the time when my head had been cleared in state hospital and I looked back at my past, came to the conclusion that I had tried to build a life while using and it had not worked and it never would. So I didn't have hope for the future. I just had a sense of clear disaster from the past. I knew what not to do anymore. The fact that I'm still in recovery and I'm essentially a day one baby, it's 26 years now, no one can be more surprised than I am, and it's worked so far all day today. I know what doesn't work. So over that summer, I'm grappling with how to understand what's happening to me, what happened before, where I'm headed as a person. How do I communicate with other people? How do I provide a context for them so that we'll have a shared sense of being in community and experience together? I'm not like anyone I know. That turned out to be a crisis. I didn't feel like I could safely conduct myself in the world if I didn't know how to build language from my experience. And there was no escape. The head injury made it really difficult to process visual information. I wouldn't learn it until later, but my autism is such that listening to oral speech, someone else's, is actually also painful. There was no understanding that I could find online that seemed to speak to my condition. Uh, I was stuck, and life kept right on happening. Life didn't ask me whether I understood or validated this or approved of it or thought it was fair or liked it. Life kept right on happening. And I had been in recovery for long enough to know that whether I liked this or not or could understand it, I was still going to be held accountable for my actions. So I didn't have the luxury of just freaking out and taking out, go to the church tower or whatever. I still needed to show up whether I understood what was happening to me or not. That was just life on life's terms. So an idea evolved. I knew that 12-step work worked because I had experience with it. Maybe not cognitive experience, but I had behavioral experience. I've been all the way through the 12 steps, a few times actually, in a couple of different fellowships. And it had given me some understanding of problems I have with anger and fear and sexuality. uh, some things about relationship. I'd worked through a lot of things with my faith experience, how to be of service, and things like that. So that wasn't a cognitive system, but it was a behavioral thing that had worked because I had not used again. That was fact. That wasn't behavior or hand waving. I began to wonder if there might be, from my perspective, I had this thing inside me that I didn't understand, and it felt so different from anything anyone experienced around me that it felt like I must be crazy. I would not be diagnosed with autism by now for another 7 years. I would learn that the heart of that wasn't insanity at all. It's because I have autism, and my way of processing is very special and different. It's not bad, it's just different. So I wondered if there would be a way to find a 12-step program that could speak to what I was experiencing. And I did some research, and I where's the stop button? Stop button. When I looked at, so I'm going to probably cut that out. So I'm going to go back a little bit. So I began to wonder if 12-step programs would help. And I did the research. All 12-step programs that I could find required that a person identify the particular kind of insanity that they were struggling with. Alcoholics Anonymous was insanity over alcohol. Narcotics Anonymous was insanity over drugs. Overeaters Anonymous was insanity like overeating. Emotions Anonymous was insanity over emotions. Um, all of these had a thing that they could identify, like a specific kind of thing. I had actually been using a certain fellowship to deal with all my problems because, my sense about what I was addicted to, because for me it was an easy translation. I had these other words and I was just going to plug and play, and it was less confusing to do one fellowship. But that was at a time when I knew what the pieces were. For this situation I was facing, I didn't know what the piece was. I tried to identify it, and every way that I had known to look at it and grapple with what the problem was had failed. It wasn't grammar. It wasn't difficulty in seeing other people as equal and worthy of respect or vice versa. It wasn't logic. It wasn't because I couldn't be a friend. It wasn't because I couldn't have a friend. It wasn't because I couldn't believe. It wasn't because I was mentally ill. It it wasn't because of any of the addictions that I had identified before. There was no map for this. I was stuck. I needed a way forward, and there was no way forward. And there was no escape. And it felt like not dealing with this it was taking a toll. I wasn't sleeping. I didn't know how to ask for help with it anymore. And it began looking more and more hopeless to me. And there was no one to ask for help. I couldn't have even found someone who understood a perspective where math and poetry were the same thing. That was going to be like the starting point to explain anything else. If you don't understand this basic thing, if you can't understand the crisis of a life that faces things that way, how can you hope to understand anything more complex? Who do I turn to who can guide me with what to do with this kind of experience? I didn't know anybody. So the summer wore on, and I kept more and more to myself, but I started thinking about the problem. And I suppose it's because I had been in recovery for long enough that I I didn't stay totally freaked out about it. I wondered what I could do in a practical sense. And it occurred to me that maybe it was me, maybe it was something about it, the way I was looking at sanity and insanity, that was getting in the way of me seeing how to identify what this was that I was looking for help for. And if I could identify that barrier and get it out of the way, I would be able to see which 12-step program to apply, and the problem would be solved and I could move forward. Because it wasn't only about solving the problem, it was that the 12 steps gave me a common language for the other people who were recovering from the problem, that they identified the same problem as me. See, it was a language system that let me be social with people who had a shared experience. Until I understood what the shared experience was, I didn't know how to build the language with them. So when I like backtrack that that's kind of the focus here. If I can understand what kind of crazy I have, maybe I can understand how I'm getting, how I can apply the 12 steps. But if I can't figure that out, maybe it's something about how I understand and identify the problem to begin with that's getting in the way. So I wondered if it was something about my understanding of sanity and insanity, and I had this idea. Uh, what if I look at how I came into relationship with those terms to begin with? And I'm considering it a single term. Like sanity and insanity are like a two sides of the same coin. So I'm studying the coin, not one side or the other. And the thought occurred to me that maybe I could look back at experiences in my past in which I'd had to grapple with the meaning of that and look at how it changed me and look at how the events changed my understanding. If I could see how, if I could have insight into how my understanding had changed, maybe it would give me insight into either ways I'm getting in my own way or a hidden way forward that I'm not seeing now. So I made an inventory of experiences in my past, much like in an addiction thing, a person makes an inventory of experiences to review how anger and fear and sexuality function or something else. This was to look at how my language functioned relative to a single notion. And I put events on my inventory that surrounded that led me to grapple with the meaning of that particular thing. So on that, to give you an idea of what the inventory looked like, I call that an anchor. And I put on my inventory, I listed events in my life in which I'd had to grapple with the meaning of sanity and insanity. Now, the first one on the list was like when my dad died, my mom freaked out. They took her away to the hospital for a while. It was bad. And when she came back, she was never the same. She had this mental illness thing. I didn't know what it was. I just knew that, the family had been shattered, and my older sisters were off doing what they did. It was me and my little brother. Mom came home every night and drank after like yelling. She yelled and she ate and she went and sat on the couch and she drank. And I stayed with her because I didn't want her to kill herself. She talked about it all the time. So I had to grapple with what the meaning, like sanity, insanity was something that happened to other people I saw in movies and stuff before this happened. When it happened to my own mother, it reshaped how I thought about it because now it's a person I actually know. It's not as easy to just write it off as like they're a monster or something. In the aftermath of my childhood sexual assault, and I coming to be aware a couple years later that I'm gay, I started to wonder like maybe there's something wrong with me in terms of my sexuality that's like a mental illness. Maybe that's broken or something. So I had to grapple with it again. When my older sister was diagnosed with bipolar, I had to grapple with it again. Um, when I started experiencing drugs and alcohol and people meeting people who had these problems too, I grappled with it again. When I met other people who had different issues, I grappled with it. So every time an event happened in my life, it caused me to reevaluate and update my understanding of what sanity and insanity were. So I did this whole inventory, and then I put the entire list of decades of treatment in mental health that had me question it all the time with no resolution. But the only tools available in my community, in my world, from what was available. I put all of these on a list and I looked at the list. Totally unexpected thing happened. I noticed a total accident thing. And this accident was the thing that actually became the foundation of the language box perspective, which is the way forward for me. It was the way that I found to stand in my own consciousness relative to language, but build words around my experience as an autistic person in a way that works with the neurotypical world. That's not something neurotypical people generally know how to do back, but it is something that I can learn and practice and develop how to do out. It changed my life. So this is what happened. I line up all of these events and I'm studying it and I have the kind of weird mind about like I just parse things out. I just do this with language all the time. I look at the patterns in it and I I find my way better by patterns. They're more instinctive to me. And I saw these patterns. These were the patterns that I saw. There were four. One, I noticed that when I put all the experiences side by side, that the meaning of the word had changed in each experience. The word had stayed the same, but the meaning had changed. So my understanding of what sanity and insanity meant before my mother went into the hospital was different than the one I had when she came home. Every time I went through an experience in which I had to grapple with the meaning of that notion, the meaning changed. So I noticed that. And because the meaning of that word had changed, it altered the way I approached my relationships. And that happened all along the way. So changing the meaning of the word changed how I participated in relationships because it changed how I thought about other people relative to that word. When the meaning and the relationships changed, my feeling of safety and participation, the way I carried myself, conducted myself, using the language in those relationships also changed. So every one of those events caused my way of life to change. When the meaning of the word and the relationships in my way of life changed, and all of those things, the meaning applied to myself, my relationship with myself, the way I conducted myself with myself, all of those changed too. So my identity had changed in each one of those events. I was a different person having gone through each one of those events. So the meaning had changed, my relationships had changed, my way of life, and by the way, meaning, relationships, way of life, and identity, those are all part of inner and outer circumstance. So my understanding of language had changed, my relationships had changed, my way of life had changed, my life had changed, and my identity had changed. And I could see that lined up like a set of dominoes. And that's when I noticed this weird thing. I could feel, looking at the entire list, there was something that tied them all together. Something was constant in all of them. I could feel inside each one. There was something about being the person in each one of those things that had stayed the same. If I went to each experience and I went back to it, I could feel my way inside it, put myself back in the experience, and it was something about the way I found my way through. Everything changed, but the way I found my way through updating the meaning, that had stayed the same. It was like some kind of instinct to resolve an understanding in a way that left me feeling safe again. That was the same. I'd never seen that before. So from my perspective, I had created inventory of my own experiences, and I had found an aspect of my own consciousness that was clear inside every experience I'd ever had, and it wasn't the words, and it wasn't my identity, and it wasn't relationship, and it wasn't my circumstance, it wasn't my way of life. There's nothing else. Like I thought that encapsulated all of consciousness. How could there be another thing that's staying the same? If you imagine looking at a landscape and everything's moving, you'll suddenly notice one thing in the exact center that's not moving. I'd never seen such a thing before. But for the first time in my life, and I was 45 years old, I saw clearly that in a way that I could understand, that there was an aspect of myself that had remained constant, that was not language, identity, relationship, or purpose. It was a fifth thing that I'd never heard of before. And I'm like, what? I was like a person who got off their first roller coaster ride when they're like 15, 16 years old. I want to get right back on. But more than that, as I started to consider that, I realized that there was an aspect of my consciousness that was safe, that was constant, that worked perfectly, that required nothing of me, that I could trust, and that it wasn't lost in the language of the world. It felt like finding the door out of the funhouse. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had found solid ground. And it wasn't an understanding that someone else had given me. And it wasn't something that was achieved through dialogue or argumentation, and it wasn't philosophical. It was logical. It was fact based, and I wondered if this could be a new beginning for me. It was the only experience of consciousness I had ever found that was open to language without being lost in it. So I didn't know if I could do the thing again. I didn't know if it was a repeatable experience. So I tried again. I chose another word and I did the same thing. I chose another anchor. I don't remember which one it was, but I did it with a lot of words because I had to test it. And I found that with each word, I could go back and it rang the same bell. It didn't matter what the word was. I could line up experiences in my own life, direct experiences. I could set all of them in motion by virtue of how I chose them to be part of the list. They're all in motion, and I knew that. And when all of them were in motion and linked side by side, I could see the thing that was staying the same throughout. And it wasn't a different version of the same thing, it was exactly the same thing. It felt exactly the same thing. And it turned out that my way of finding my way through to another understanding, a new understanding, an updated one that feels safe and grounded is a way that I do in my own way. I believe that everybody has their unique way of wrapping their mind around something in a way that resolves the issues to allow them to feel safe with their circumstance, or at least as safe as possible. It's an individual thing, but it's a constant, transcendent, permanent individual thing. It's an aspect of myself that passes every test. It shows up 100%. It kept me alive inside every struggle. It worked whether I understand or don't understand. It works in and out of relationship. It works no matter what my identity is or isn't. There's no context that holds this. It's the big thing. So when I'd done this enough, I started feeling that it was a new psychological position to be in, and I came to realize that I had sort of set up. I found a way to set up language as if it could be built into a box, and when the box was created properly, experiencing and looking at the box allowed me to see clearly a new kind of consciousness in myself that had always been there, but it had been so basic and fundamental that I'd never noticed it before. And I'd never heard of anybody else noticing this either. Not this way, certainly. And it wasn't hysterical, it wasn't metaphysical, it wasn't drug induced. It was logical, it was grounded, it worked with all of my recovery. It didn't change. And I could test it over and over again. And I would call foul immediately if something was wrong with something. I could hear it like a bell if something's wrong. So I tested it, and I was ready to throw this out, and it never failed again. It felt like I had stepped from a funhouse world into the real world for the first time in my life. That was 10 years ago. I lost everything because the life that I had built in the mental health model crumbled around me. Had relationships without any idea of how to conduct myself. I was abused and didn't know that. Eventually, I ended up out in the streets. I went out west. And while I was out there in Oregon, somebody finally asked me, "Have you ever hit your head?" I said, well, yeah, but it didn't hurt me because I didn't pass out. They're like, "You should see a neurologist." The neurologist explained concussion. He explained expressive aphasia. He found a brain rehab. He found a medication, a blood pressure medication called clonidine that in high doses can work for TBI. And my life changed and turned around, and I started finding my way back. At the end of his report, he said, "I suspect you have autism." I lost housing in Oregon and eventually found my way back to my home city. And I got a new primary doctor, and she was able to find a neuropsychologist who could identify me as having autism. Last year, I went through a lot of evaluation in New York State, and they concurred to the extent where they switched me from the Office of Mental Health track to the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities. I have disabilities related to my autism. Oddly enough, though, my son also has autism, and he was diagnosed in high school like 16 years ago. His autism is not identical to mine, but it's similar. His IQ is similar. Um, so it's been a pleasure to start feeling like the things like now that I know not to pathologize it. When I talk about how everything seems like the same subject, or the patterns in everything, or being able to process sound as if it was sight, or touch as if it was smell, those are normal things for me. But I thought I was crazy, and he's like, "No, Dad." He does some of those things too. I've met other autistic people and spoken with them. They experience those things too. These are normal parts of autistic life. I had used them to approach mental health professionals and be pathologized by them. I had taken off those meds. I still have an antidepressant, but it's to moderate PTSD. I have a problem with rage and fear. I'm My life is very quiet. 10 years later, I have created the language box perspective, and I apply it because I found myself in a world where it's neurotypically based, and the world does not have language tools, from what I can see, to fathom the autistic experience. And there are certain aspects of neurotypical language that are designed to keep contexts in place. If you have a form of consciousness for which no context has ever been built, but you live in a world that has a need for its own safety to retain the context it has with no way to build beyond them, that's a perfect storm. How is it going to be possible to get a model here for this kind of consciousness if part of this, in order to maintain its integrity, is to conserve its own connections that don't know how to include this experience? That guarantees that they will stay separate. There's no way to bridge the gap. So my goal in sharing language box work, I have no idea if these ideas will work for anybody else. I know they work for me. Initially, I thought they would work for perhaps other autistic people, but I've been interacting with other people from all walks of life for about 10 years now, and they seem to apply everywhere. Anywhere there's language, this is a way to safely outgrow a compulsive grip on existing understanding. It's my hope that a lot of the problems that we face in the world, in our society, that we haven't been able to solve, can start to be resolved. For example, when a young person comes out as gay or trans, if the parent doesn't have a way to build a context to include the kid, very often the kid can get blamed and it becomes unsafe. And the parent can be seeking to preserve their understanding, their context, and not be able to enlarge it to include the child. They'll exclude the child. I've seen it happen in reality. I have protested to mental health things that are bad for me, and a person who's treating me has had so much need to hold on to what they studied that it's actually my fault for being non-compliant. There are situations in which, as a man, voicing objection to being framed in certain ways is treated as being disloyal to those who are more disenfranchised. So it's my hope that by presenting these tools, it may give individual people, if they connect with them, it's my hope that they will have a way to come to see that within themselves, they have an aspect of their own consciousness that passes every test, that will hold them and continue to respond even when when they don't understand what's happening, even when they're in a trauma state or they lose things. Like, they will know that there's a place. It changed my life to know that whatever happened psychologically in my life, there was a part of myself that would always succeed. And I had the evidence for it, not secondhand, but in my own experience. With practice, that I believe that can be a functioning part of a person's living consciousness. When I see the world that way, and the traditional way and bring those two together, it's been like my right eye and my left eye learning how to work together, and a new dimension comes into view. Um, it is a much stranger and wonderful, more miraculous world than I ever would have imagined. And it's my belief and hope that that world will have a larger language system, and that that language system will be one in which it's safer for people to find their words, safer for them to be different, safer for them to feel like they belong, safer to know what they know, safer to let go of things that don't work, in the hopes that with a wider system and all of us being our amazing selves together, we'll begin to tackle the problems that our civilization faces as we pass from childhood of humanity to the adult civilization that I perceive us building. That's my first talk, the Language Box Perspective, and I will see you for the next one. I imagine there will be about 10 of these talks. They'll all be about an hour long, and I will welcome comments or feedback. Thank you.